everybody. Welcome to today's lecture in the Bern Lecture Series in Health Sciences, and all the lectures hosted by ISPM this year follow closely or broadly the issue of participatory health research from various angles. And today's lecture is organized in close collaboration with a research group on climate change and health. And we will have the talk around 40 to 45 minutes first, and then time for questions and discussion. And I hand over to Anna to introduce the lecturer of today.
Thank you, Annika. And well, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Isabelle Anguelovski. She's the director of the Barcelona Laboratory for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. She's an ICREA research professor and a senior researcher and principal investigator at ICTA, and coordinator of the research group Healthy Cities and Environmental Justice at the Instituto Hospital del Mar de Investigaciones Médicas. She is graduated with a bachelor degree in political studies and an MSc in international development at the University of Paris in Sorbonne. She obtained a PhD in urban studies and planning from MIT, and currently she leads and participates in several national and international projects, and her main research interest is to assess how environmental injustice is materialized and contested. Currently, her focus is on 4 main research areas: the politics of green city as a growing global planning orthodoxy, the social and racial manifestations and impacts of green gentrification for historical marginalized residents, urban planning for health and well-being with a focus on health equity and justice and inclusivity in climate adaptation planning, including distributional and procedural insecurities produced by adaptation plans, interventions, and land-use configurations and regulations. And today she's going to talk about beyond green branding, planning climate responsive cities for all. And with this, I hand over to Isabelle. So please feel free to share your screen. And as you know from other series, she will be talking for around 45 minutes. And then we will have a Q&A in which basically all of you can talk and ask her the questions that you want. Thank you very much.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Yes. All right. So hello, everyone. I cannot see you. You probably cannot see me anymore at this point, but I'm excited to be sharing some of the work we do in the lab. I'm very grateful also to be able to talk to a climate and health audience. That's a combination that I do not always have the privilege to be discussing our work with. So thanks so much for the interest in the research, and also for inviting me to the seminar series. So the broader argument that I want to formulate here is to think through the way in which planning for green cities is creating, in some ways, new inequalities and new health inequalities, but has also the opportunities to turn unequal urban development around and create new spaces for inclusivity, equity, and justice. Just to give you a little bit of context about who we are. So I co-coordinate a lab, which is called the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, which, first of all, is organized around what we call an ethics of care in academia. So we try to value different ways of recognizing excellence, of recognizing contribution, participation, to do a lot of work with communities and with policymakers, and then to also translate and share our work in dynamic and in really also co-produced ways with the stakeholders with whom we work. And to just give you an idea of the broader themes we work with, they range from a broader engagement with inequalities in the green and sustainable city. So, for example, issues of environmental and climate gentrification I'll talk about today. We look at civic engagement for green and just cities. We look at alternative economic movements and paradigms such as degrowth. We have a specific focus on understanding climate risk and the counter infrastructures of climate risk. We very much integrate a feminist lens in our work, together with also a lens that comes from housing justice and the inequalities embedded in the unequal green cities that have to do with the way in which real estate development and housing is being conducted. And then finally, we have these lens of urban health equity, which, I know that a lot of you are working around. And none of the work, as I was describing, that we try to do very much brings together different political actors, such as, for example, regional governments and the Parliament of Catalonia, for example, around the new neighborhood redevelopment law. We do courses for local planners around planning for the climate emergency. And we also contribute to international reports around green justice. But anyway, what is the question that I want to ask today? It's the following: how can we build healthy, green, and climate responsive cities for all? What do I mean here? So first of all, when we talk about green, there's a broader definition, right? Some people tend to focus it very specifically on green infrastructure, green space. Others expand it to more the green transition, like the energy transition in particular, broader issues of sustainable mobility planning as well. We do in some ways, but let's say today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the green infrastructure aspect and the climate resilient infrastructure in particular. And so, first of all, what's the basic historic state of affairs that many cities are facing? They are facing what we call a green divide. That is that on the one hand, you have historically wealthy, privileged neighborhoods with a greater access to quantity and quality green spaces. And then you have more working class neighborhood like La Trinitat in Barcelona on the right, who, when they have access to green infrastructure, tends to be of lower quality and still surrounded by gray infrastructure, by contamination, and by other, let's say, types of undesirable developments. Why do we care about that? Well, we care about that because, as you know from your field of study, the contribution of green space to lower risks of all-cause mortality, but also to improve physical and mental health, and to a variety also of social outcome. Green space also plays a particularly important role in confronting the climate emergency and climate risks in particular. Take this example here of Plaza Ángel Pestaña in Barcelona. It's the main plaza of a neighborhood called La Prosperitat, which is historically a working class neighborhood from migrants from other parts of Spain who came in self-built and then lived in this neighborhood under the Franco dictatorship. And then it expanded to become a very dense, gray, and building intensive neighborhood with nowadays a lot of heat exposed and heat island areas. And so not only do people not have access to the health benefits of green space, but also to the climate protective impacts of green space, which then creates what we call in our group a form of quadruple urban climate injustice, meaning that socially vulnerable groups are those who have least contributed to climate change, are more exposed to impacts, have fewer means to adapt. So meaning they have less access in particular to this green adaptive infrastructure against heat or flooding, but also, and that's something I want to touch upon today, are more displaced by climate resilient infrastructure, either directly because this infrastructure replaces their home, or because of the real estate prices and speculation that creates a housing market that's highly unequal. And so when you see neighborhoods such as Poblano in Barcelona, which is a new tech and design neighborhood in the northern part of the city, when you see it becoming greened with 17 new 1,000 square meters of green space to respond to climate impacts, the immediate question that the neighbors ask themselves, in addition to, well, that's really great, but for whom in the mid and long term? All these spaces amenities and infrastructure for working class and for the traditional residents who have lived there before? Or are those at risks of displacement already being displaced because of the new unequal urban development dynamics that both the tourism industry and the high-tech industry, like you can see the buildings on the right here, are bringing? Our argument here is that actually it's rather the negative. That is that vulnerable groups are now facing what my colleague Helen Cole calls compounded environmental, climate, and health riskscapes, especially in post-industrial urban landscapes. There is an overlap, there is a composition of different riskscapes, even in the green city, even in the city that tries to articulate climate responses that are green. So what does that leave us with? Well, that potentially leaves us with all of these green climate protective infrastructure and other, parks and gardens that play let's say, a more diverse role in the city to become green Lulus. That is green locally unwanted land uses in racially mixed and working class neighborhoods. Thus, a type of public infrastructure that has the risk of recreating health and climate inequities. So let me walk you a little bit more through some of the concepts that underpin the research that we do and that I'm going to present in a few minutes. The first one is the fact that cities are engaged in a global greening mission. Take this example of Boston, Massachusetts. You see a waterfront through all of the, let's say, more climate vulnerable areas of the city, which actually also happen to be more working class or racialized neighborhoods, completely greened. There is a vision of the green, 78 square kilometers of green space that are meant to protect those neighborhoods against sea level rise and against flooding, plus, of course, heat mitigation features and benefits as well. So there is this global mission that also is exhibiting in places like Nantes, for example, that has more than doubled its amount of green spaces between 1985 and 2010. Places like Dublin, where in the working class of the Liberties, you also have what's called a Liberties greening strategies about adding trees, parks, community gardens, and other types of street infrastructure to address a historic lack of green spaces. So it's a global orthodoxy, if you will. That is also illustrated by the number of awards that places are applying to. The Green Cities Europe Award, the European Green Leaf Award, the World Green Cities Award, meaning that what we see is a dominance of competition between cities to be the greenest, the most climate resilient, the most livable, the most sustainable. So that in the end is a race to being an attractive place for investments, for newcomers, for a creative class, for a design class, by using the value that green, or the guarantee, if you will, that green brings you as a city. The problem is that what we see is a form of a green illusion or a green gloss in that sense. Take the case of Bosco Verticale in Milan, those two skyscrapers that you see here. On paper, there have been 1,500 plants, 900 trees that are all adorning the facades of those buildings. But in reality, the cost for transporting and extracting the resources that help create those buildings can actually not be offset, the environmental and climate costs in particular, by the greenery that you see here. Nor can the greenery on the bottom, which is the Libraries of Trees Park, also offset those costs. These costs that are even more, let's say, acute from a social standpoint, meaning that the average price of the units here to be sold is 7 million euros. So who can access this green, this green Bosco Verticale, if you will? And so there is a form of green value, right, that gets created, what we call a green gap or a green grab. That is that what we've seen in our research is that investors, bank, real estate developers see an added value, an added guarantee that building green, building next to a green space or even financing greening and financing, let's say, climate resilient infrastructure is giving to their investment. So there is a form of elite capture, if you will, where these different, let's say, elite interests appropriate the value and the rent that comes from green space and are able to also bring it down to the consumers and to the society, but in a way that's not universal and in a way that does not create, let's say, win-win benefits for everyone. Hence then, what we call environmental gentrification, or a term that was coined in 2009 by Sarah Dooling, and to which we give a little twist. In her view, what was environmental gentrification? It was the implementation of an environmental planning agenda that is related to public green spaces, but that leads to the displacement or exclusion of economically vulnerable population under an environmental ethic. And so, in some ways, you have an independent variable, which is greening, that contributes directly or indirectly to your dependent variable, that is gentrification and displacement. We are adding a little bit of a twist here by pointing at the green paradox, which is that even if greening is not the major driver of gentrification, first of all, it accelerates and it intensifies it. But on top of it, if you are gentrified out as a working class resident, even as a middle class resident or as an immigrant from a neighborhood that also has become greener and more climate resilient over time, you are having a segregated aspect, you're having a segregative benefit to green space. That is, you are being removed away. You are being separated from that green space, often having had to move to more gray and climate exposed neighborhoods. So there's a division, again, of access to nature, which this figure here is meant to represent a little bit. And that's what I'm articulating with this kind of updated definition to green gentrification. It's not just that greening on the left accelerates or produces gentrification, which actually itself advocates for new greening. It is the fact that this gentrification itself, even when there is no greening, displaces residents to a more climate exposed neighborhood. And sometimes greening itself, actually, because it takes place in demolished public housing or social housing, means that residents, or residents of color, working class neighborhoods, socially vulnerable groups in general, will be displaced to more climate exposed neighborhoods. How do we study this? And that's where I want to go over some of the studies that we have. We study this in 4 different ways. Through a look at displacement and dispossession from the point of view of financial, physical, aesthetical, and social cultural dynamics. We've done this work in approximately 30 cities in North America and Europe in particular, cities around 1.5 million residents. And so first, we've looked at it from a financial dimension. In this report that we published in 2018, what did we do? We gathered comprehensive, systematic, and huge data on the branding of the green identities that cities have exhibited through plan, through communication material, through media, through website. And on the other hand, a lot of data on cost of living and on prices in general. And what did we find? We find that there was a positive, significant correlation between high levels of urban green boosterism, so that branding, and high levels of unaffordability, even when you control for population size and economic indicators. So what does that mean? That the cities that tend to have this greenest identity tend to also be those that are the least affordable to working class and middle class residents. So here again, with cost of living being our most important indicators. We've also conducted interviews with 200 investors in those cities where we've been able to test this green grabbing idea that I was exposing earlier. And what do we see here? Well, we see that effectively investors are able to extract discursive and material value and rent extraction strategies through green space. What do they tell us? They can increase the price of homes. They can increase their ability to have mortgages at lower prices. Their residents are able to rent out their places at higher, to rent out their places to, to higher income residents. They are also able to guarantee the financial feasibility of the project in front of other investors better because of the value that they're able to give to green space. And so that's the financial, let's say, profit-making, grabbing strategy that we have seen in our research. Then there's a huge part of our research which looks at the physical dimensions of gentrification, right? Gentrification and displacement. That is that over time, lower income, not university educated, and racialized residents are those moving out of a neighborhood and being replaced by higher income, higher educated, and residents who are able to afford higher rental prices. So this is this phenomenon of gentrification and displacement from a social demographic and physical standpoint. The initial study we did was a simple correlation. The case of New York City as one of our case studies. What do we see? We see that the areas that most greened between 1990 and 2014 were also those that gentrified during that same period. So there is a statistically significant relationship with the two. But again, it was, if you will, just a correlation analysis. Then we did a little bit more of spatial modeling where we used geographically weighted regression, GWR, to look at the individual role played by green spaces, in particular parks and gardens, on gentrification. And so we mapped the ones that Barcelona, for example, created between 1990 and the financial crisis, so 2004, 2005, in the below median income areas of the city. And then we looked at neighborhood demographic and rental price change just around those parks, creating a buffer of 400 meters around them and looking at those changes in the buffer in comparison with the broader district, what type of social demographic change we saw. And here, what did we see? We see that approximately 60% of the green spaces that were built, so the parks and gardens in particular, between 1990 and 2004, had an impact on gentrification. So these 60% of spaces exhibiting green gentrification. Just give me a minute to drink something. Next, and this is a study that we just published in Nature. For once, we have a paper in Nature, so I have to mention 2 months ago, which is, okay, we're going to explore this entire data set, and we're going to look not only at parks and gardens, but the entireness of green spaces built in a city between 1990 and 2016. And we are going to look at a broader time period, and we're going to do that in 28 cities across 2 continents and with very different, let's say, urban trajectory patterns. Some being like shrinking and contracting city from a population standpoint, others being a fast-growing city, some being a more dense city, others being more of a sprawling city, etc. So what do we see? If you look at the left table, you see different patterns. First of all, overall, you see that in the majority of our cities, you find green gentrification patterns at the citywide level. So taking gentrification as a whole territory. In 17 out of 28 cities do we see that. And we also see different patterns. So for example, if you look at the top left, you see that places like Atlanta, Louisville, or Seattle had a very sustained green gentrification trajectory with parks created, with green space created in the 90s and also in the 2000s, and with then ensuing gentrification in the 2000 and 2010. You also see dynamics where green gentrification was actually throughout the entire study period from the 1990s to the 2010, but not as much recently. And that impact, let's say, was most present 10 years ago and kind of sustained over time. Vancouver, the case I was mentioning to you earlier. Boston, a city also that has invested a lot in green space. Then you have worsening cases, which is Barcelona, that actually green gentrification started at the end of the 1990s and continued until now with an accelerating dynamics. And then you have, for example, in the bottom part, gentrification, green gentrification being exhibited only in the most recent period. And that's in a way also a very serious case, which is the one of Austin, Montreal, Nantes, Copenhagen, and even Detroit, which tell you, okay, if you built a green space in the 1990s and early 2000, those would not have had an impact necessarily right after. But actually for the most recently built green spaces, then those really had an impact on green gentrification, which is how we can see that. Well, because basically the cost of living really accelerated, the number of higher income residents accelerated as well, as did the number of college educated students, while the loss of vulnerable residents also accelerated. So again, here different patterns where you see worsening cases of green gentrification, let's say continued cases, and those that are a little bit more stable, but not necessarily great. And then in contrast, we have a few cities that are those on the right, where we actually see a negative explanation for greening and gentrification. Why? Portland and Amsterdam, what is our take? Well, our take is not that gentrification does not happen. Those of you who've been to Amsterdam, you know that it has happened, but it's not explained by greening per se. It's probably most explained by other types of infrastructure. For example, in Portland, it's much more by transit systems and bike lanes. In Amsterdam, it's much more by the entire cleanup of an area and real estate development. And at the same time, you also have had neighborhoods such as Vienna, where you don't see a relationship at all. And why? Because probably you have had much more protective social housing infrastructure and other types of, let's say, housing rights being sustained over time. And that's very known for those who study Vienna. Then this study also revealed a few things, which is, okay, in some studies, greening is really the most important variable that explains gentrification. And this is in all of the cities on the right. So here we recognize the usual suspects with a high green identity: Copenhagen, Austin, Atlanta, Nantes, or Vancouver. And then you also see cases where greening plays a super important role in gentrification, like Barcelona or Boston or San Francisco, but is integrated with other factors, including real estate development. And then finally, what does this slide tells you? It tells you that, okay, if you now break that gentrification down, green gentrification down by types of green spaces, what do we see? We see that in all of the regions, parks is the type of green space that most explains gentrification everywhere. Then you see that in Europe, there's an important role for greenways and recreational spaces, while you see that in Canada, it's gardens themselves who tend to play a more important space. And in the United States, you also have, to some extent, greenways in addition to parks. And so I won't enter into much detail here. What I wanted to say is that we're looking here at the citywide effect. So it doesn't mean that, for example, a community garden per se will not have a gentrifying impact on a local neighborhood. But it means that if you take all of those green spaces together as a broader unit of analysis throughout the entire city, they are not necessarily significant in Europe, while they are, for example, in Canada, and in the US, it's a little bit more mixed. I pass on the Barcelona slide, it's becoming too complicated. I also want to point out briefly what we see at the social cultural level. What is green gentrification at the social cultural level? What did we do here? We did a study looking at the use and perception of green spaces in 2 gentrifying neighborhoods of Barcelona. And we wanted to ask, how does new green public space affect families and children's use of these new green spaces? And what did we see? We see that the neighborhoods that have a greater consolidated gentrification or a late stage gentrification, such as the center of the city, Ciutat Bella, display a lower use of green play spaces, poorer perception of those spaces by the residents, and a loss of community cohesion and place identity. People feel out of place. People feel that they have lost their neighborhood. People feel that they cannot trust their neighbors because there is greater crime, especially when there is a conjunction between gentrification and tourism. And those trends that we see in Barcelona, we found them in other places as well. For example, in Montreal, we have a lot more police in the neighborhood that we used to have and kind of do patrols of the park. So it's harder to have a healthy mix of people in these places. In Dublin, we feel so excluded from it that it's a deep anger, it's a big anxiety and a deep feeling of isolation. Or in Washington, a sense that a new park is not for the residents. When they are done with the park, most of us probably won't be here to enjoy it. We will be good enough as workers, if you will, to serve you Slurpees and hot dogs at the River Festival, but not to live there. So a sense, again, that you might not be yet displaced physically by gentrification, but that the place has been taken over by gentrifiers and by, let's say, police and surveillance forces that undermine traditional uses of green spaces by long-time residents. And finally, I wanted to point at some aesthetical characterizations of green gentrification. So here we asked, how do features in and around parks affect gentrification? Here, what my colleague Ana Terra Morin Maya did was to look at both gentrified and non-gentrified parks in Barcelona, again, and see what was going on. Like what's happening in those parks? What are they used for? What are they valued for? And what is being represented in social media? And so what she found is that the greenery of the park, so how diverse a park is from a biodiversity standpoint, does not matter in explaining green gentrification. But the infrastructure, yes. So if you see parks that have iconic features, artwork, a very prominent architecture, like the one in the middle, then you have a form of demographic change that represents gentrification that can be identified. But features that privilege a bit more community uses, like the one on the left, and social bonds do not seem to have, let's say, an aspect linked to green gentrification. So just, to go a little bit more in detail into what's happening really in those parks. And then finally, what we are doing now is characterize climate gentrification, right? And so what do we call climate gentrification? Well, we call it, and especially green climate gentrification, the fact that vulnerable residents are those that are most likely experiencing residential and social displacement in the short and midterm from green climate infrastructure and its associated gentrification risks. And so, you have different types, as I was mentioning earlier, of green infrastructure that builds climate resilience, rain gardens, permeable pavements, restored shorelines, green roofs, resilient parks, etc. And so what we see is that in some ways, the homes of those residents is more exposed to climate risks due to the way in which green resilient projects are done, because in some ways of the slopes they create or the exposure of basements of working class residents to sea level rise impacts and flooding. I can describe that a little bit more. Also because they feel socially excluded, right, from, again, these green resilience projects. But then in the future, what we're already seeing is a risk of displacement because of real estate speculation and increased housing costs in those previously affordable areas, and residents in the end who cannot adapt and are losing networks. How did we measure that? So my colleague Galia Chokri, in a study from 2019, had a look at Philadelphia, a city that's very much known for its green resilient infrastructure program, and also one of the fast gentrifying cities in the US. And what did she see? By identifying all of the acres of green resilient infrastructure in all of the census tracts of the city, so these are all of the circles here, and by superposing this data to gentrification scores that she calculated, so the highest gentrifying census tracts are those in darker blue, she found that the areas that most gentrified from 2000 to 2010 are those who least benefited from green resilient infrastructure between 2011 and 2016, so just after, right? So, okay, you have gentrification, and this is where the green resilient areas are being built. These are the ones attracting investment in urban greening. And what do you see? You also see that I'm sorry. You also see that the areas that lost the most Black populations, which is the map on the left, and that's the areas that are in blue. The blue polygons, and those that lost the most Hispanic populations, which are the green polygons, are those that gain the most green resilient infrastructure. And where did those residents move to? They moved to area. I am so sorry. I don't know if I can finish, but I'll try. You also see that the polygons in red that have gained the most Black and Hispanic residents are those with very little new green resilient infrastructure. I'll pass on that. And I'll pass on that too. What are equity-centered alternatives for green and just cities? And maybe so that I can recover, I'll stop for a few minutes. And if you have questions about the first part or the studies, I can answer them and I can rest my voice a little bit. I don't know what's happening. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries, Isabel. I think it's in a way normal for all of us. Yeah, probably we can start, give a few minutes for questions. If anyone would like to say something, please just unmute yourself and feel free to ask Isabel.
Yeah, maybe I can rest for 5-7 minutes and then I'll finish and then we can.
No worries. No worries.
Oh, sorry.
It's normal. So yeah, probably I can, break the ice. Well, I think it's very interesting how you try to put together two major crises that we are having today. On one side, the climate crisis, and as well the social crisis in terms of inequalities, environmental justice, etc. I have the impression in general that how we are, when we want to tackle these both crises at the same time, we have to think about it's more a kind of long-term perspective, because usually what happens with human beings, we want everything right now and we want benefits now and we want to save now. This idea of investing and having kind of benefits in the long term, and sometimes it's very difficult to sell to policymakers. So I want to ask you, what has been your experience in trying to deal with that, especially with them? You have been in contact with Ayuntamiento de Barcelona, and you know very well how to handle these stakeholders, especially how to sell this science and try to say, okay, if you want to do this, be careful because of that. And what is your experience?
Maybe I can add one question to it to give you 2 more minutes to recover a bit. Linking to Anna's question, if you get in touch with policymakers and about potential impacts of one solution or the other, I was also wondering, how do you draw the line between the research and activism? So one thing is about science translation or knowledge transfer, but how can you talk about gentrification and the impact of the middle class or working class without becoming a full-fledged activist? Or do you combine those roles within yourself or within your team? Thanks.
Okay, so I'll take advantage, I'll reshare my screen and I'll talk about those 2 questions, and I hope it will be okay. Oh my goodness. So coming back to your 2 questions, here we are. So what we have seen in the cities with which we have engaged in the policy and the planning side is that what you need is a combination of 2 types of policies. On the one hand, anti-displacement and anti-gentrification tools, and on the other hand, equitable green development tools, which are much more about how to make those green spaces inclusive, co-designed, responding to the needs and to the identities of people, even if they are not displaced, let's say. And so last year, after conducting case study research in 24 of the cities I presented, again, North America and Europe, we produced this analysis called the Policy and Planning Tools for Urban Green Justice, which is also on our website. And what did we see here? So we see that there is a variety of tools. Some of them have to do with zoning, like inclusionary zoning for more social housing, meaning that local municipalities and planning boards are requiring developers to include a certain percentage of social or public housing in market price development. In Nantes, something is pretty impressive, 56% of all units have to be social housing. In Barcelona, now for any new housing, it's 30%. In the US, it tends to be around 10 to 15%. So there is much more resistance and much more lobbying from developers. So that's one interesting measure. Places like Philadelphia, what do? They have something called a land bank, which is a repository of all abandoned, underused, or vacant land in the city. And Philadelphia has had a history of close to 40,000 of them, trying to make them be bought by community groups, community development corporations, different types of nonprofit developers, and almost like giving them away for social purposes. That's also an important tool. Other cities have what's called density bonuses, meaning, okay, you developer, you have the right to build your building higher, but you have to include also a certain amount of social housing in them. So that's, again, how do we increase the percentage of social housing? Then you have something else, which is maybe more targeted to renters, or let's say to the residents themselves. One of them is the limitation of freezes to property taxes when they increase in gentrifying neighborhoods. Others have to do more with rent control or rent decrease or rent vouchers policies that are very much for renters. And then you have something interesting, which, for example, is a transfer tax or a development tax on luxury housing. So many cities are building these kind of green luxury developments with developers then leaving the units unsold or sold but non-occupied. And that's the type of tax that are meant to address, vacancy and speculation a little bit more. And then finally, you have interesting cities such as Portland, Oregon, that say, okay, you've been gentrified out, not necessarily by greening, but now that we have, are rebuilding the neighborhood through kind of mixed use development and adding all of these sustainability and climate resilient features to it, you, gentrified resident, is going to be the first one to have the right to return, and we will guarantee some units for you. So these are interesting kind of, say, policy experiments that we have seen. And then on the other side, which is what I was talking about earlier in relationship to making those amenities be more inclusive, what do we see is hugely important? First of all, is to support informal greening by residents themselves, including on vacant land, and ensuring that it's not just the very formalized or very aestheticized greening that gets built, but also the one that residents are, let's say, actively mobilizing from the ground up, which is a little bit your question. Zoning for urban agriculture is also particularly important because many residents are involved in allotment gardens, in community gardens, but it's not protected. And so if you have a zoning of a certain land just for urban agriculture, you make that land be much more permanently protected. So that's just an idea. And so to go briefly over some examples, Nantes is a city that has had these very large redevelopment of green areas from, let's say, post-industrial land uses, and has been able to very closely associate social and public housing with green spaces, and add also for every new, let's say, eco-district, individual and community gardens. And so here you are having eco-districts that are not necessarily kind of gentrifying fancy upper class types of eco-design and eco-districts, but much more resident-centered. And then you have cases of mobilization. So you asked also about this for much more radical green initiatives. And I'll try to make it a bit simple because this is maybe much more for geography types of let's say, audiences. But what is important here is also to make greening much more reparative for residents, victims of slavery, trauma, dispossession, and deprivation. And so we're going back here to the deep histories of segregation and slavery that many American cities have experienced, and created a form of reparation through greening of those histories. And so what do we see in Washington, D.C., for example? We see that there's a big project called the 11th Street Bridge Park Project, which you see there on the top, that is meant to reconcile two sides of the Anacostia River, mostly white, gentrified side called the Navy Yard, to the other side, which is called, that you see here on the right, which is called Anacostia. And so here the green spaces are built for and with the value of the history of the space in mind. It is accompanied by what is called an equitable development plan, saying, okay, before the space is even built, we need to think about green jobs, affordable housing, community land trust, like a control over the value of the land, and the fact that land should be protected from developers. And there is even a right to return and a right to place approach that is being embedded here. And it's a work that's led by nonprofits. So it's not a work that's led by the city itself. And it favors, again, kind of this reparative approach to greening, with valuing networks of care, recognizing histories of trauma. So having a lot of activities around greening that will value also the more hidden or invisible practices in relationship to blue and green spaces that racialized residents have had over decades, and that very luxurious, let's say, greening is at risk of invisibilizing. So just to conclude, I want to make it clear that for sure we recognize in our group that urban greening and green spaces are vital to climate, ecological, and human health. But achieving equity requires questioning all types of exclusion that are embedded in now these like green city orthodoxy. So I will leave it there. And if you want to have a look at the other ways in which, let's say, we have worked on these themes with local groups and municipalities themselves, I invite you to have a look at the website, because there you can see what we call an interactive web documentary, which is called The Green Divide. And it has many small videos of activists fighting for green justice in Nantes, in Barcelona, in Montreal, in Boston, in Portland, and in Washington. We have also a lot of story maps using ArcGIS that really brings together the history of neighborhood from gray to green, from contaminated to let's say more livable, and also, of course, the whole green inequalities that I was talking about. You have another documentary that's focused on Barcelona, which is called To Green or Not to Green, and then other small videos on what we believe in the end is at the core of urban green justice, which are 10 drivers of urban injustice. And this is a book that qualitatively tells you the tales of the history of urban green inequality. So the Nantes case I'm talking about is there. The Washington case is there as well. Thank you so much. I did not answer your question very specifically related to policymakers. How do they react? Well, I think you have two types. You have the types that have been pushed by nonprofits on the ground, by community movements for climate and green justice, like the ones in the US, that are like, yeah, it's true, green gentrification, climate gentrification exists. We need to have grants. We need to have funding programs for NGOs to build community resilience, to build anti-displacement tactics, and in general, to make sure that greening does not displace. So these are the American cities. And then you have European cities, including Barcelona, that say, okay, yes, gentrification, yes, displacement, yes, unequal urban development is true, but we don't fully believe that it's just because of greening, or that greening even plays a role per se. And so, okay, great, to your work, but not really. And so in some ways, they're like, okay, there's a value because we see that there is, this constant risk of displacement. And yes, we know that we need to add housing and social protections and, protect informal green spaces. But because the city has historically been so gray, anything that can undermine the agenda of this green mission is not, is a threat for them.
Thanks, Isabelle. Yeah, I open the floor if anyone wants to ask another question. We have 5 minutes left, so feel free to speak up. Not, I have more questions. So yeah, I see one hand here. Yes, Harvey, please.
Yes, it's Harvey. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Isabelle, I really enjoyed your talk. It is very informative. I like this concept of emancipatory greening that you mentioned. My question is, I wonder if you also looked at the experiences and perspectives from low and middle income countries, because many of the examples come from Europe and the US. And in many cities in the global South, in Asia, for example, Bangkok, Manila, also in Africa and in South America, I think this is also a problem. And I wonder if the greening experiences there are, of course, I expect that they also lead to gentrification, but I was just thinking, how similar, how different it would be with the experience in the global North. Thank you.
I think that you're absolutely right to put an emphasis on the global South, because the violence and the unequal enforcement of land rules in ways that undermine the rights of informal residents is completely is very prevalent and is a big threat in the global South. So what do we see? We see that in protected areas that are meant to be green, while informal settlements are being replaced by a park or by a by different types of green infrastructure. And yet high income and luxury buildings have the right to continue building. We see that in Jakarta. We see this in Medellin as well, where we have done some research. And so, you know, this unequal enforcement of protection rules is something that is very prevalent and very acute, as is the forced displacement of people. So that's something very much in the center of our mind. What we also see is that many times informal settlements themselves are being greened against flooding, against landslides, against mudslides, etc. And then you have an improvement of public spaces in ways that then brings more investment, you know, more tourism, more hotels, like we see that in the Rio favelas. And then these public green spaces become used by visitors, which tend to be white and tourists, let's say. And then the practices of Afro-Brazilians and others are becoming undermined, or are becoming also criminalized and controlled. And that we've seen that very much in Babylonia, in Rio, that yeah, you have these really beautiful new public spaces, but who has the right to organize celebrations and parties and all of it? These are, you know, tourists and white residents who've come and built a bar there. But, you know, Afro-Brazilian use of the space is becoming criminalized. So you're absolutely right. Are you working on this, or do you have a project that looks at this?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I don't, but I think it might be worthwhile to explore that.
I'm always interested.
But thank you for your perspectives on that.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Isabelle. We have just 1 minute left, and you know, we tried always to close very sharp on time. So probably, I don't know if Annika, you want to give a final note or on Isabelle's presentation, or because I think we don't have much time for a question, could be.
Yeah, not much time for questions left, but thank you again for being our guest today and providing some insights into the research you are doing. I thought that was a very inspirational talks to also look beyond the boundaries of the research on urban health and climate change we are doing, and maybe also to make us brave to look at blind spots in our data and finding those indicators for gentrification, for displacement, and really become aware of issues like that. So thank you very much again. And everyone who's still online, please feel very much invited for the upcoming talks in November and December. There will be an invite going out, and we will have 2 further great talks on issues on cancer implementation and participatory research, and on free play in the city. So urban health will continue being with us in this lecture series. Thank you again, Isabelle, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you very
Have a good
much, Isabelle.
afternoon. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.